So what sort of things could we be doing to show that support and to help our team through that change? Well, there are some change management models and theories that we're going to look at in a bit more detail, and we might decide to employ one of those. We've established that people and individuals have different experiences, beliefs, values, perspectives, and we can recognize those individuals and recognize what they can bring to the change. To help that as well, we can show leadership skills. We've talked about the different sorts of skills we can show in different areas and in different times on the continuum, so we can think about that. And we can also look at the organisational culture that we're in and how that's impacting on the process. We can also make sure that our communication is very open, it's very full early communication, and that we get full involvement and participation with everybody. And we can look at making sure we're managing the process so that people feel as if things are going in the right direction and they feel comfortable that somebody is actually in control and taking these things into account. And it needs to be managed because we must remember that it's not staff's responsibility to manage their change. It's the employee's responsibility to do their best as directed, and we will need to manage them and lead them because every person's different in every situation. There's factors such as health, maturity, the stability of the organisation, the experience of the people involved, personalities, motivation, etc. Yes, participation and open communication is going to help, but it's the overall responsibility of senior management and the executives to ensure that their employees are in a situation where they can adapt and they can cope with the change. The manager, yourself, even down the team level, has a responsibility to initiate, facilitate and enable that change. And enabling it means to help people understand the reasons, the aims, show them the ways they can respond positively and in their own situations and with the capabilities they've got, because there is one key fact: effective change is about involving people, not imposing on people. It sounds bad, but developments in leadership styles, as we've looked at in previous units, tell us that it's now more effective to interpret, communicate and enable people, that consultative sort of participative involvement, rather than telling, imposing and forcing the autocratic way, which was thought of as the way to manage people in the workplace. Nobody responds well to that, and with things such as British values being promoted and democracy, it's about engaging employees. And that's how we get change through. So we need to support people. Lots of things we can be doing. And for effective change management, there are some key actions that we can carry out to make sure that we help and ensure that our team and that the process is as painless as possible. And the first of those is that we need to assess if there's a readiness for change. That's the people, the business, the change, and that's before we even start, really, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail in a second. So we need to assess the readiness for change. The second is we need, going back to open communication, we need to consult and involve the team in the decision making. There shouldn't be any surprises. It shouldn't come to them afterwards about why we're making these changes. Thirdly, we can plan activities and plan the support requirements. If we've thought about those two properly above, then we should be able to plan what we're going to do. Fourth, we should ensure effective communication of our plan. So it's great having a plan, but we need to make sure everybody knows about it and the methods we're going to use. People are already going to be going through enough knowing there's a change. What they shouldn't have is any surprises about the way we're going to communicate it, the way we're going to go about it, what the plan is. So we should have explained that to them. Fifth, we need to remember our empathy and emotional intelligence that we've talked about. First, we need to empathise with people. Just because we think the change is natural and it's not a problem and we can't see what the issue is, that doesn't mean we should dismiss people's issues with it. And then we need to recognise our emotional intelligence, know about how our emotions are being shown and the impact that's going to have on other people's emotions and the triggers there may be there to start people off or for things to go wrong. And that could lead into conflict, which we've already talked about. Sixth, we need to start thinking about appropriate leadership styles and using them based on, as we've talked about in previous units, situation, task and individual. And then seventh, we need to consider a change management model or process that we're going to use, a technique. And we're going to look briefly in a little while at a few: Kotter's 8 Steps, ADKAR, McKinsey's 7 S's, and Burke-Letwin. And we'll go through those in detail, and there'll be a handout on those. But we need to consider using one depending on the situation, because they're all different. And then 8, and quite critical, we need to regularly review the required changes to fully understand if the feeling or the impact has changed on the team, because all those things get done at the end, then we just plow into it thinking, right, that's it, we've got a plan, let's go ahead. But we need to be regularly reviewing things, and we'll talk later on about having some short-term wins and things that we can use to sort of motivate. And at each of those stages, we really they're like a milestone. We need to review the impact and fully understand where we're going and what's happening. So 8 key steps there that we can do, and we'll start looking at the first one: assessment for readiness of change, in the next session, in the next slide. So what was number 1 on our set of actions for effective change management? Anyone remember? Well, it was that we need to assess the readiness for change. Yeah, it was on the top of the slide there. So what does that involve? Well, considering a change or the managing of change, there are 2 critical things that we need to assess before we even start or embark on putting our plans into action, because these help us formulate our plans and decide what we're going to do and how we're going to approach it. And the first is the assessment of the change itself. So that's about examining some key factors: the scope, the depth, the overall size of the change. So the sort of things we've got to address are: what is the scope of the change? By that I mean, who's involved, whether it's just our team, just the individuals, specific individuals, is it a whole department, is it a division, is it a whole organisational change? And secondly, the number of employees that it's going to impact on, the effect it's going to have on. So how many are there? Because that's going to make a difference perhaps to how we go about it. We then need to decide the sort of type of changes it is. Is it an operations change? Is it processes or systems? Is it equipment, technology? Is it going to affect people's job roles, etc.? And then finally, the amount of change from the current situation. Are we just tinkering around with things, or is this some sort of real change? Is there currently change going on? We don't want to put more change on top of that, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. Or is there a history of change? Is there an effect of a culture of change that's been going on? So these are the things that we need to consider under the readiness for change in the actual change itself. And the next thing we need to be making an assessment of is the team. Each team you've been involved in, I'm sure, has its own unique characteristics, its DNA, as you might want to call it. And that change management, depending on that DNA or characteristic, is either going to be easy or it could be more challenging. Those attributes that team has need to be understood so that we can see the potential obstacles you might get from one team and the resistance that might come, whereas other teams, it wouldn't really have so much of an impact. So those are going to include things such as, that'll be things such as the culture and value systems of that team. Or are they different to the department or the organisation as a whole? Because the culture and the values they have is going to make a massive part in the way they react to change and what they will be like. The next is the capacity to change. How much change is already taking place? We've mentioned. Are the individuals able to cope with that a certain amount of change? And if there's already change underway, how's that going to work? Can we wait for that to be implemented first before we start putting another change on top? Because otherwise that's going to cause difficulties. And then there's the leadership style. Knowing our team is going to be an important factor about the way we manage them in that period. And the key success to that will be implementing the right leadership style for the individuals, the team, the organisation as a whole. And then there's the residual effects of past changes. Have there been changes made in the past? How did they go? Did they go wrong? If they've worked, then that could be in your favour. If they have gone badly, that could derail it and cause massive amounts of resistance. So that history should be your starting point for managing this new change. And there's the line management support for the change. If there are people with a high degree of control in the line management, maybe above you or below you, Do they have a strong influence over their peers and their employees? And if they are strong leaders, are they feared or are they followed? And depending on this, you'll have to look at how their influence is over your team. And finally, if the environment is right and it's right for the team, are the employees ready for change? Probably the most critical factor of all of this. Are they prepared for the change? Do they recognise the need for the change? Because that's going to make a difference on to whether you have high or low resistance and why. Really, it should be driven by them, or at least the recognition of the change should be taken on board by them, and then they can be involved in it and discussed in the plans. It's not about doing things in isolation, as we said. It's about consulting, involving the team in the decision making from the start of the process. As we said in point 2, and as it said in the video, if there is an information hole, someone will fill it, and they will often fill it with things that are worse than what you're actually trying to do, worse than reality. And this assessment and the consultation is to help plan for point 3 that we talked about, which was planning for the change and support requirements. And the information you gather in this assessment of whether things are readiness for change will be an important bedrock of those plans. There's a handout that gives those details of what we need to assess in each area, and we need to get that done before we even start looking at the change. And to expand on a couple of the other areas where we talked about the actions that we could do to support a team after we'd planned the changes and planned our support requirements, it said that we should have an effective communication plan. So to be effective, we need to make and that we're using appropriate techniques. We need to make sure we've planned our communication and some sort of strategy about it. We've already talked about good communications when we talked about it in Unit 303. We talked about effective communications, and we talked about different types of communication. So we need to make sure we're using suitable types and that we're thinking about having meetings, briefing, open events, intranet type communication. It's about the different appropriate types. So face-to-face for some people, broadcast, digital, intranet, email, newsletter for others, so that everybody's feeling that there's some form of communication that works, because it might be based on where they're based, whether they're dispersed, whether they're remote workers, etc. So planned but with suitable types of communication. We need to make sure that we're using the appropriate types of language, language that can be understood, that is formatted appropriate to the audience, not in jargon if they won't understand it, not in management speak from if it was an organisational management plan, from the strategy of it, because that is just going to make it more difficult for and cause opportunities for barriers for people within your team. So it's part of your job is to translate that into an appropriate language, and then make sure that the message is coming from the right people. We talked before in Change about champions. It's about people who are respected that can pass the message on to the right people. And that might not be always you for everyone within your team. So you may need to choose people and use a cascading type of communication. But take these into account, and you need to have some sort of planned communication strategy for your change management.